Somebody better tell that preacher it's time to get started. Okay, we are in 2 Samuel 23. Quickly approaching the end of the book. And it's been a saga in this big combined book of Samuel. We've started from the origin story of Samuel himself, from before he was even born, all the way through Saul and now David. And as we're approaching the end of David's life, as I mentioned before, these last few chapters are filling out some of the other details from David's life and helping to answer the question, what is David's legacy? What does it mean to be the Lord's anointed? David is, if you're looking forwards and backwards, David is the success story for doing better than Saul and fulfilling God's purpose for the Lord's anointed and for the nation of Israel. And then he's also the benchmark by which the future kings are going to be judged. When you get into Kings and Chronicles, you're going to see that a lot more. But then also we see the failures of David and that he has not done everything perfectly. And while we can acknowledge that he's the kind of person who always comes back to God, he's very persistent in that, and that's why he's called a man after God's own heart. He also does have a lot of flaws and imperfections, a lot of bad decisions that he makes. And so as the Lord's anointed, even though he's kind of presented as the ideal here in Samuel, there are a lot of questions that come up about what can this really mean? Is this really the best that God's people can have? And we know from our perspective, of course, that Jesus is the true ideal and going to fulfill everything that David could not. So chapter 23 is a chapter with two different things in it. We saw just in chapter 22 the Song of David, which is one of the Psalms, actually Psalm 18, and that was David looking back over his life and thanking God, praising God for all the times that God saved him and delivered him and strengthened him throughout a life of a lot of trouble and pain and difficulty. Now in chapter 23, the two things we have what are called the last words of David, which are not really the last words of David. We'll talk about that in a second. But an oracle of David, kind of another psalm or song of David. And then we have kind of a military record that's given of some of the heroes of David's army over the years. So, this first part, verse 1 says, "Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David, the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who was raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel." So typically when we think somebody's last words, we think like their dying words, like the very last thing that they say before they die. This is definitively not the last thing that David ever says. Chapter 24 is going to have another event in David's life. Maybe you could quibble and say that actually happened before 23. The chronology can be loose at times in Samuel, but even aside from chapter 24, when you get into 1 Kings, you see David's final instructions to Solomon, and David at such a feeble point that he is bedbound and trying to set things up for Solomon to be king. Those things certainly happened after these words here. So why then is this called his last words? Well, that can sometimes just be taken more generally, kind of at the end of his life, or if you observe the fact that this is written in verse, written like as a poem with poetic structure, that this could be the last of David's psalms, the last of the poems that he writes or the songs that he writes. over the course of his life, and he wrote a whole bunch of them, and a bunch of inspired ones are contained in the book of Psalms for us. This one is not in the book of Psalms, but quite possibly this is the last one that he ever wrote. It could also just be this last very significant formal oracle that he gives. An oracle is a very special word. Like, this is more than just a poem. It's more than just a psalm. Who knows what it means for something to be an oracle? Lisa? Yeah. Right, yes. The idea of an oracle is words that have come from God, flowing through someone else. And so this is more than just David's musings, more than just something he scribbled down. This is an oracle from God. A similar word would be a prophecy, but there's not there's not really like a future, foretelling element here. This is more David looking back over his reign and what kind of king he's been and what his goals are as he continues to reign in the last years of his life. So that's kind of what we mean by an oracle and by these last words. Let's read the first few verses here and then ask some questions about this. So verse 2, from the sweet psalmist of Israel, "The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. For does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordained in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? But worthless men are all like thorns that are thrown away, for they cannot be taken with the hand. But the man who touches them arms himself with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they are utterly consumed with fire." How does David describe his relationship with God? It's not exactly the focus here, but kind of as he's describing this at the beginning. Gary? Yeah, okay. So he acknowledges God as the Rock of Israel, and we'll talk some more about David's rule in just a moment, though that's really tied into this. It's hard to separate these. But he also, when he's saying that the Spirit of the Lord speaks by me, his word is on my tongue, like he is saying that these are God's words that are flowing through him. Again, that's that idea of an oracle. But there's a closeness of relationship that is necessary for that to happen. Of course, God does speak through different people for different reasons, different times in the Bible. And sometimes you have these sort of one-off events of God speaking through someone, but it's a little different with David. That God has been with David throughout his whole life, as he just said in chapter 22 with that Song of David. And now there's, I get this feeling of a peace and a relationship with God that is forged over an entire lifetime. And so he has the words of God that he is going to speak in this oracle. Yeah, so God has this special covenant with David, and that's going to be a really important part of this too. That adds to that relationship. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So what's interesting about those metaphors there, because I agree with you that he sees this as a blessing from God and a function of God. But in those, like he's specifically talking about the effect of his rule on Israel. That he says, let me find it here, at the end of verse 3, when one rules justly over men ruling in the fear of God, he's talking about himself, that he has ruled justly over the nation of Israel, that rule dawns on them like the morning light and the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain making grass sprout from the earth. David's essentially saying, I've done a good job here, and I have been a blessing to my nation, and that this long rule that David has had is something that has greatly benefited Israel. And this is objectively true. Israel is in a much stronger position at the end of David's reign than they were at the beginning. Even though there was lots of turmoil, even though there were multiple rebellion attempts and lots of wars that were happening, the nation is being strengthened over time. Aaron, you got something to say? Yeah, right. Yes. And that's something that helps color this whole thing. So like we're talking about this being an oracle from God, this is not just David patting himself on the back and saying, oh, I've done such a great job. Like these are God's words that he assesses David as having done a good job. Yeah? Yeah.
Ruling in the fear of God.
Yeah.
His instruction on how people are to rule.
Yes. And there's that element, that instructional element is there, I think, because he's starting to look at the fact that somebody's going to have to come after him, right? Like you can really tie that in to Solomon, his last words to Solomon when you get to 1 Kings, that he has a lot of things to say to him about that. But he is, in some ways, like acknowledging what he has done for the nation, but then he's going to circle back to this and also acknowledge that it's not just because of him, that this is God's assessment of him, but his success and the glory that has resulted comes because of God. So verse 5, for does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all my help and desire? David knows that the reason that there is success in Israel is not just because he has reigned justly, as he is saying is a good idea for kings to do, and that God is saying is good for kings to do, that the success that David has had, and by extension the success of the nation of Israel, is directly the result of God's covenant with the house of David. It's God who has enriched David's life and enriched his rule and that of his entire house. He has not forgotten this, and I am impressed by that, because this was something that God promised David all the way back before he even became king, when he said, I'm going to build up your house, build up a house for myself from your house. I'm going to make you to rule and make your descendants to rule. And when we saw that way back before David was king, when he was still just having been anointed by Samuel and looking forward to this sometime in the distant future, David was very thankful back then, and that makes sense, being told that he's going to be blessed and going to be elevated by God. But now that all these years have passed where he's been king, does he remember that? Yes, he does. He knows that everything good that has happened to him is because of God. And for someone to rule for literal decades and not forget how they got there and not forget how they are sustained, it's very, very noteworthy, very praiseworthy even. Yeah, Dave.
One could take this where God's you know that's not true. It's a reflection of God.
Yeah.
I believe he did reflect on his life.
Yeah.
He could have done it. He could have said, "Is this how we pray? Is that how we pray?" But he didn't. He talked about faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
The benefit of that, we can stop whoever.
Yeah.
They need to do the same thing. We need to do the same thing. It's interesting that our crew would have been normally that God through the Spirit, Holy Spirit, into that, for lack of a better word, strength. Say, I don't believe that he put his words in here to say this, right? I think that's more of he was in the openness and purity, honesty, to say everything we talk about in this life.
Yeah.
Successful and fail, so that other people can do the same thing. Because when you reflect on the Bible, and admit your failings, that there's nothing other than reflect on your life, and look at both sides, your failings and successes for God, that strengthens you.
And it can be both. Like the nature of inspiration is complicated. Sometimes we think of God giving people the words to say as if those people have nothing to do with it at all. That they're just sort of mindless robots to write the things that God has said. And then on the other extreme you have, well, these are the words of men who were thinking about God at the time. And in reality, neither of those is completely true. God does give the words, the actual literal words to these inspired writers, but he's able to do it in a way where it still uses that person's personality and writing style and history and their own reflections like that. That's why all the Gospels are different, and they reflect the men who are writing them. That's why you have different genres and writing styles and even the personal reflections of the people who are writing them, yet they can still be the literal inspired words of God. I think that's what you have happening here with David too, with the song that he wrote there in chapter 22. They are his personal reflections, but they are also the inspired words of God that God is using out of David's reflections. And the same thing here in 23, that David is able to openly reflect on his own life, yet it is still called an oracle of God, and so it is coming from God too. I think where those meet is when you have someone who is so united with the purpose of God that God's words are very natural coming out of David's mouth. That he is a man after God's own heart, and he cares very deeply about what God wants. Gary? Yeah. Yeah, right, absolutely. The Psalms are a good example of that. You can use Proverbs in a similar way. Proverbs can be very, very personal, where you have Solomon talking to his son and telling him, these are the things that I want you to remember and to do. This is natural conversation between father and son, yet also the inspired words of God that should be considered infallible and perfect. Inspiration is complex that way, but a beautiful, powerful thing that God is able to do. So yeah, like it's good for us to recognize what Dave's talking about here, that these are David's reflections looking back at his life, which we can understand that to be the case, even acknowledging that this is also an oracle of God. But the maturity for David to have, to be able to look back on his life, to, like we talked about last week with chapter 22, to know how much he relies on God and how much God has delivered him, here to be able to acknowledge that generally he has done a good job ruling his nation, but it's all because of God. It's because God is with him. It's because God has this covenant with him. David attributes it all to God and not to his own competence or prowess. And that's very different than what most kings and powerful people will want to do. It's very natural for people, especially as they're reaching the end of their lives, to think about their legacy. How am I going to be remembered? And so we want to leave a lasting impact on the world in whatever way that we can. And so we think about the impact we've had on our children and grandchildren and the people around us. If you've got money, then you start thinking about how you can donate money to things that are going to outlive you and to do good in the world. If maybe you want a statue erected of yourself to have people remember your name and likeness forever. All sorts of things that people do to be remembered. And the kings, having great power and wealth and being the kinds of people who would end up in the history books, they have a real chance to try to write history, to remember them in a very positive way. And so that's why in a lot of historical, ancient historical documents we have that were kind of ordered to be written by the kings, a lot of times they are greatly exaggerated, greatly massaged in order to portray those kings in a positive light. Remember, typically these people thought themselves to be gods. So we're not going to talk about their failures. We're going to instead exaggerate their successes and show how, they make the world go round. That's not really how this historical account of David has gone. Like, we've seen overall a positive interpretation of David's life, to be sure. Like, the writer of Samuel has a pro-David stance, definitely, but has also not shied away from David's failures. That is very unique in ancient historical documents. They were often not all that concerned with keeping the facts straight and giving a very literal retelling of the things that happened. They would be very selective in what they wanted to talk about. So David has this maturity to be able to reflect on his life, to know where it all came from. Whoever is writing this history is doing that with David, but David's doing that with himself too. Lisa? Yeah. Yeah, and that's really significant. And the more you get into Kings and Chronicles, and this is definitely the intended effect based on how many times it's said in these books, when it keeps comparing back to David, you're meant to draw those kinds of observations where we go, man, none of these people really live up to David. Even the good ones don't really live up to David. And when you talk about Solomon, you're going to note that Solomon is probably the most successful of the kings of Israel politically and economically. He has the most earthly success and strongest and most peaceful reign out of any of them. So from a purely secular historical perspective, Solomon is the peak. From a religious, spiritual perspective, David is the peak, and it goes downhill from there, generally speaking. And as it peters out at the at the captivity, then it starts looking forward to somebody who can match David, and even better than David, more than match him, surpass him in Jesus. Yes, I think that's correct. If you didn't hear what Lisa said, she's picking on that verse on verse 5 of causing all of David's help and prosper to help and desire to prosper, making David's house secure. This is another theme of Samuel, but it's not just about David, but about the concept of David's house. Right? It's God from the beginning has told David, it's not just about you. It's also about your descendants and what I'm building up in your lineage. Now, David generally understands this as his descendants are going to reign after him. That his son will take over, and then his son's son will take over, so on and so forth. And that does continue for a long time. And that is the predominant interpretation by the Jewish people, that descendants of David will always rule in Israel. And again, as we know, that is not true. That descendants of David do not always rule in Israel, but there is an end to that. And that's kind of a shocking revelation when it happens, because that's sort of the easiest interpretation when you're this far back in history here in Samuel. So yes, there's a messianic, prophetic component to this that David may or may not fully realize. He probably doesn't. But there's something bigger at play than just David, and even than just about the fact that it's his son who's going to take over after him. That we are looking at Jesus in fulfilling this covenant in a very special way. Anything else through verse 5? Okay. So what is the fate of evil in David's kingdom? Verses 6 and 7. Excuse me? Yeah, they'll be burned up. So David here calls them, worthless men, or even literally worthlessness. It's a fun word to say, worthlessness. Kind of personified. And that's a word we've seen throughout this. When horrible, just dreadful things have happened in the book of Samuel, and even farther back, Judges has this. A lot of times they're called worthless men. Certain worthless men got together and committed this atrocity. Certain worthless men opposed God's anointed. Certain worthless men took it upon themselves to do what they thought was best. Like that's been a common word and common theme throughout these books. And so David says these certain worthless men are, that they do not have a future in my kingdom. Evil does not have a future here. They are like thorny weeds that are thrown away, that are destroyed with weapons and burned up, that evil will not last in David's kingdom, because David is wholly against evil. Now, you've got different layers of fulfillment for this, right? David's talking about his approach toward evil and how he views this, and it's his pursuit of justice. That was what as Aaron identified for us. That was like that instructional element of verse 3, that kings are supposed to rule justly. And David is saying, like, this is what I have done, that evil men do not prosper in my nation because I am against evil. There's also like a future interpretation of this, that this needs to continue in Israel. Of course, in a way, this doesn't really come to pass, right? Because the evil grows in Israel. Because as the kings do not match up to David's legacy, the evil prospers more and more, and it becomes the status quo in the nation. But there's a prophetic element that evil will be defeated through the one who perfects what David began, that Jesus is going to defeat evil. Yeah, Aaron.
Kind of going back, what Lisa was saying, Messianic,
Mhm.
piece of what is said for God, that it's through David's house, that fulfillment of prophecy, where his reign will be established forever. And it's in that evil is going to be dealt with.
Yes.
And I think if you take all of 5, 6, 7 together.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I think you take all these things together, you see this is what David is beginning is supposed to be continued. The question that you should be asking yourself as you go through Kings and Chronicles is, like, this doesn't, like, does this even seem to be working? Like, David is concerned with the covenant that God has with his house, but for the most part, his descendants don't care about it. For the most part, his descendants are not keeping up their end of the covenant. David is concerned with justice and with eradicating evil, but for the most part, his descendants do not do that. And so, like, yes, there's this prophetic element to it, and we're looking forward to it, but then, like, if you're a Jew living in the times before Jesus and you're seeing all this happen, you're left with this question of, is this even working? Is this even coming true? Like, we're getting worse and not better.
And that's why every king is compared to David.
Yeah.
And they're waiting for this.
Yes.
They're waiting for the king that's going to come that will surpass them.
Yes.
And they keep waiting.
Yes, and I keep waiting. And over time, their picture of what that king will be changes. And they start thinking of, which of David's descendants is going to come in such righteousness and power and going to bring Israel to heights that haven't been seen since the days of David and Solomon. But they're still thinking in a very earthly perspective, like that's their view of the Messiah, of causing Israel to be a great world power. And we see that on display in the Gospels when that is like the baseline assumption that all the disciples have. Like, this isn't just a fringe idea, like this is just common knowledge at this point. This is what the Messiah is going to do. And Jesus, of course, challenges that notion by showing that he's not a political leader and he's not about making an empire of Israel. So, Lisa? Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it starts to come down with Solomon a little bit. But yeah, then it plunges. Yeah. Right. And the fact that the kingdom, fractures after Solomon's reign too. That they only get through 3 kings before they've split into 2 nations. That's not the intended result. That's not what God wanted for them. That's not the way it was supposed to be, but this is how fast things are falling. You will make all those observations when you're in Kings. So like that's David's oracle, David's poem or song that he writes here. Do you have any other thoughts on this? Okay, so I know there's a lot of chapter left, but not tons to talk about in the rest of a chapter. I just want to highlight some of these things for us in the 10 or so minutes that we have left. Because the rest of this chapter is given like as a military record. And these are really common in historical documents, really throughout all of history. But especially ancient history, that you have the records of the heroes. These are the people who fought and risked their lives for us. These are the people who brought us great victories. Of course, it was really common in ancient historical documents to exaggerate these war stories, which I'm not saying that is what has happened here, just putting it into context of what often was done, that you would have the epic tales and the epic songs of how they came to win these battles, and that they would exaggerate the exploits of the heroes and of the rulers involved. They want a very powerful history to inspire people for generations to come. And these things would often be turned into songs that would be sung at the festivals and feast days of the nation, the important holidays, to kind of rally everyone to the nationalist cause that they had. And those things were really important to them in maintaining unity and in convincing people to stay together in their loyalty to the king and loyalty to the nation that they were a part of. Here we have a much tamer version of what was often found in those ancient documents, in that this is pretty straight-laced. Like, this is given much more literally than a lot of them did. So that is an interesting note here. We don't see the kind of exaggeration or clearly fictional, clearly legendary tales that you would see in others. This seems pretty straightforward. But you have a record of a bunch of different people. And here is kind of how it's broken down. You have references to the three. Those would be the three like highest ranking, most valiant men of David's army, the three of his closest mighty men who would be with him at all times, who would be relied on for everything, who are tools in David's hand for anything on the battlefield. The three are legendary figures in David's army. And then you have references to the 30. The 30 are also a legendary band of heroic, mighty men, just one notch down, one tier down from the three. These, again, are going to stay very close by David's side. They're going to have prominent roles in David's army, have rule over important parts of David's military exploits. And so anyone who is part of the 3 or the 30 is a legendary figure. And I don't mean legendary as in fictional or false, but legendary as in inspiring and heroic and famous in the nation of Israel. So you have the 3 who are called by name. There's Joshua Bashabeth. I'm going to go with that. Okay. And it says he was the chief of the 3, the most decorated and most famous of the 3. So he's got the greatest position and honor of them. It says that he got that honor from wielding his spear against 800 whom he killed at one time. I will note that in 1 Chronicles it says 300 instead of 800. Numbers are a really common place for copyist errors to happen, and a lot of times we can tell which one is correct. In this case, we're not really sure. One or the other is a copyist error there, so it's either 300 or 800. Not really important, because either way you have this incredible feat where one man with one spear was able to kill hundreds of enemies all by himself. Great prowess and valor. Then you have Eleazar, who's the second of the three. It talks about a time when the rest of the Israelite army fled from the Philistines. He stood firm, and he fought those Philistines all by himself so long, and he got so fatigued that his arm was frozen to his sword. He couldn't even loosen his grip from his sword, that it was cramped onto it. That's how long he was fighting them. And the victory and his bravery there are attributed to God. Then you have the third of the three, Shammah. He also refused to flee from the Philistines when everyone else did. He defended the fields, defended the land, and again, the victory there is attributed to God. Gary.
This verse 10 talks about
Mm-hmm.
one place that marked in my Bible. It says the Lord gave the victory,
Mm-hmm.
and how hard is that going to fight?
Right.
10 was the battle. It was, in my mind, grateful reality.
Yes. And you see that in these military records here, that the valor of the man is praised, but also God is glorified for bringing the victory. We've noted the same thing with David's victories too. David fought hard. David was brave and valiant, but it was God who gave him the victory. But God giving the victory doesn't mean you just sit there and say, okay, God, go ahead and do it. It's grab that sword and go. You have work to do. You've got a battle to fight. It's a very good note that we've seen all throughout Samuel, but good to note here as well. Okay, then you've got a story of three brave men who were part of the 30, who, when this is sometime when they were all trapped in a cave by the Philistines, and David said, "Oh, that I had a pitcher of water from the gate of Bethlehem." And the three men said, "Okay, we're going to go get it." And they fight through the Philistines all the way to the gate of Bethlehem, and they get that pitcher of water, and they come back to David with it. And David was so stuck. That was not an order that he gave them. That was the sort of the idle wish in a desperate situation. But he acknowledged their bravery, their heroism, and didn't even drink that water himself, poured it out as an offering to God, as kind of glorifying their efforts and the victory that God gave them. Aaron.
This little, it's an interesting story, kind of in this accounting. But it just reminds me of how important it is for those people in authority to be careful of their words.
Yeah.
People that are in positions of authority, they speak, their words have weight,
They do.
and just be mindful of that.
Yeah. And how much did they look up to David and trust in him to be willing to do that for him? Yeah, I don't think you can read that as David giving them an order to go do that. That's just them jumping into action at the smallest idea that David wanted something. So yes, be careful of your words, and also the inspiration of a great leader is very, very powerful. There are a few other listed here. Abishai, we've talked about Abishai quite a bit. Honor beyond his position, promoted again and again. Benaiah strikes down 2 heroes of Moab, kills a lion in a pit in the snow, kills a huge Egyptian. When he only has a staff, the Egyptian had a spear. Again, valor beyond his position. He was set over David's bodyguard. And then the rest of the 30 are listed afterwards. And you'll note that there are 37 members of the 30, which sounds kind of funny until you realize that, some come and go over the years. So no trouble there in having 37 members of a 30. But this is given as a way to honor those people, but also like as inspiring stories for the Israelites and for us. Like, valor and heroism and, fighting for the cause. Like, this is what it means to serve your leader, and this is what it means to follow after him no matter what. Dave? Yes. Again, very different than how a lot of these records would go, but ultimately the glory is being given to God, even when honoring these men. Lisa? Right. Yeah, Uriah's in there. And that is, we know what happened to Uriah. Got some sadness in that too. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Next week, chapter 24, last chapter.